The clang of metal echoed through the narrow corridor like a warning bell. Cold air slipped through the gaps in the wooden planks as the American officer turned the heavy key. From the inside, the sound froze every woman in the barracks. They had expected shouting, maybe punishment, but not this. The lock clicked shut. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Their breath fogged the air, canvas coats rustled, boots scuffed against the icy concrete. Somewhere outside, a generator coughed and died into silence. It was early 1945, rural France. A converted warehouse now fenced with barbed wire and snow. Around 40 female German prisoners stood motionless, eyes darting to the officer's hands. The rumors had traveled faster than the winter wind. American guards had started disappearing. Prisoners after dark. When that bolt slid home, most of them believed they'd just joined that list. The officer's face was unreadable square jaw, mud on his boots, a sidearm resting against his belt. He scanned the room once, nodded slightly, then turned to face them. No interpreter, no threats. Just that look that said stay calm. The silence was louder than the lock. According to Red Cross records, over 400,000 German POW were held in Allied camps by war's end. About 3,000 were women, many nurses or clerks caught behind collapsing front lines. Few ever saw combat, but captivity had its own battles. Disease, hunger, and shame. These women expected rage, vengeance, humiliation. What they got instead was confusion. He locked the door himself. One of them later recalled, "We thought, this is where they take revenge." Her words carried the sharp edge of that night's fear. The officer turned toward a metal stove in the corner. It was cold, ashes grey. He crouched, struck a match, and fed it like he'd done it 100 times before. Sparks flared, smoke hissed through the tin pipe. The women didn't dare breathe. Why would he trap himself inside with them? What was he planning? Minutes passed. The warmth spread. The lock stayed shut. Then came another sound. A tray being dragged across the floor, metal scraping concrete. When the officer looked up again, he wasn't carrying chains. He was carrying coffee, and that's where everything began to change. Steam curled from the mugs like ghosts of normal life. The officer's gloved hands set them down one by one. Tin cups, filled to the brim with something that smelled almost unreal, real coffee. Not the grain substitute they'd grown used to. Not bitter acorn powder, but the sharp, rich scent of roasted beans. The German women stared as if he'd placed live grenades between them. No one spoke. A few exchanged glances, unsure if this was mockery or mercy. The officer didn't explain. He just said, "Drink before it freezes," and turned away to pour the next round. His tone carried no threat, no pride, just fatigue. The kind of voice you hear after too many nights without sleep. Private logs from the U.S. Army's POW branch note that the average German prisoner under American custody received 200 to 300 calories per day, nearly double what civilians in Germany were getting under rationing. But facts don't translate to trust. In that dim barracks, facts didn't matter, suspicion did. One of the women, a former telegraph operator, lifted her cup slowly. The warmth seeped through her trembling fingers. She hesitated, eyes flicking toward the officer. Was this some kind of trick? Poison? He caught her gaze for a second, just long enough to nod once, then go back to the stove. The first sip drew a quiet gasp. The taste was bitter, strong, real. Around her, others followed silently, cautiously. Then came the first ripple of sound in the frozen air, a sigh, half sob, half relief. The officer didn't smile. He just leaned against the doorframe, watching the steam rise like white flags. Later, one of the prisoners would say, back home, "We never got this much, even during rationing." That line would echo in Red Cross interviews years later. A single sentence that carried all the contradictions of that winter. Because in that moment, the enemy wasn't the man with the coffee. It was the hunger, the cold, the disbelief that kindness could exist here. But kindness doesn't erase fear. It only confuses it. And when confusion starts to thaw into curiosity, someone always tests the boundary. That test came with a spark, and a single match the spark cut through the silence. One prisoner, a young nurse with cropped blonde hair and eyes that hadn't slept in days, pulled out a crumpled cigarette. Every head turned. Smoking inside the barracks was forbidden, and doing it in front of the American officer. Unthinkable, but she didn't care. She struck the match, shielding the flame from the draft, and inhaled like it was oxygen. The smell of tobacco mixed with the coffee's fading aroma. The officer froze mid-step, his gaze locking on hers. She exhaled a steady stream of smoke toward the ceiling, defiant, waiting for him to shout, but he didn't. Instead, he reached into his own pocket, pulled out a pack of Lucky Strikes, and lit one for himself. For a few stunned seconds no one moved, then slowly, unbelievably, he offered her a light. Cigarettes by 1945 had become the currency of captivity. A single one could be traded for soap, bread, or even safety. In many camps, they were the only thing more valuable than food. For an American officer to share one, that was a code breaker, a quiet rebellion against everything the war had taught both sides. The nurse took the cigarette from his fingers, her hand shaking just slightly. The ember glowed between them, two enemies bound by habit and smoke. Around them, whispers rippled like wind through dry grass. One woman murmured, "He didn't shout, he just smoked like we were equals." That moment cracked something deeper than fear. The officer looked exhausted, his uniform creased, stubble shadowing his jaw. The matchlight caught the silver dog tags at his throat. You could see it in his eyes. This wasn't about discipline anymore. It was about endurance, his as much as theirs. The air softened. The tension didn't vanish, but it bent, shifted. For the first time since their capture, laughter, small, nervous, disbelieving, flickered through the room. Outside, snow started to fall again, tapping lightly against the tin roof. The officer ground out his cigarette, nodded once, and walked toward the far table. The nurse watched him go, her face unreadable. When he returned a moment later, he wasn't carrying another match. He was holding a stack of envelopes, letters from home. The letters looked harmless creases, stamps, thin paper browned by travel. But when the officer dropped them on the table, the air changed. Every prisoner recognized the handwriting before they dared touch an envelope. Home, the word felt foreign now. The nurse who had smoked earlier reached for one, her hands trembling so hard the paper rustled like dry leaves. The officer spoke quietly, almost awkwardly. Mail call, he said, his voice low enough to sound like apology. Then he began sorting them by name, mispronouncing every syllable, each mistake softening the tension. Some envelopes were ripped, others stamped in, see it censored. Black ink blocked out lines like wounds across words. He noticed a few women struggling with English phrases scrawled in margins, so he offered to translate. Carefully, gently, when he came to one that mentioned Hamburg, he hesitated, his eyes skimming the sentence twice. Then he translated around the horror, not through it. He left out firestorm. He left out gone. By mid-1945, 75% of Germany's major cities had suffered heavy destruction. Millions displaced, hundreds of thousands dead, but these women didn't have numbers. They had names. Streets, rooms, he read the letters like fragile relics, pausing when the tears came too fast. He read softly. One of them later said, as if trying not to break us, "Outside, snow kept falling." The generator coughed, then died again, plunging the barracks into a quiet so deep it seemed physical. The officer stood there, letter in hand, the light from a kerosene lamp flickering across his face. He wasn't supposed to do this. Officers didn't read personal mail to prisoners. It blurred the line between captor and comfort. One of the women finally asked, "Why are you helping us?" He didn't answer, just folded the letter, placed it back into her hands and looked toward the rattling windows. "Storm's picking up," he muttered. "Stay inside." She nodded, clutching the paper like it was life itself. He turned, heading for the generator shed outside. That was the last thing they saw before everything went black. The moment the lights died, the world shrank to sound. The generator outside gave one final metallic groan and then silence. Thick, absolute. A second later, boots scraped against wood, a cup fell, someone gasped. The darkness swallowed everything. Wind howled through gaps in the boards, carrying flecks of snow inside. The temperature was dropping fast. Reports show winter 1945 hit below -10 degrees C in parts of northern France. Within minutes the room turned into a freezer. The women huddled together, their breath turning to fog. Someone whispered that the Americans had cut the power on purpose. Someone else whispered revenge. Then a metallic creak, the outer door shifting. Panic shot through the barracks. He's coming back. One woman said, voice breaking. They braced for shouting, for punishment, for the sound of gunmetal. Instead, the door stayed shut. Nothing, only the wind. It's strange how darkness amplifies fear. Every memory becomes a threat, every silence an accusation. For these women, fear was muscle memory. In Luftwaffe bunkers, in night raids, in interrogations they'd learned that darkness always brought orders, and orders always hurt. One of them struck a match, the flame trembling. For half a second her face appeared. Pale, lips cracked, eyes wide. The match hissed out, leaving only the smell of sulfur. A sob rippled through the room, then footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. The latch turned. The door opened just enough for a gust of snow to whip through. A silhouette filled the doorway, the American officer. He didn't shout. He didn't even look angry. What he carried in his arms wasn't a weapon. It was a stack of blankets. Behind him, another soldier followed, holding a tray of soup tins and a bundle of candles. For a second, no one moved. The women couldn't process it. He stepped inside, set the blankets down, and lit a candle. The tiny flame threw long shadows across the walls, turning faces into moving shapes. He's helping us, someone whispered. The officer just nodded toward the stove. We'll fix the power when the wind dies, he said. The candlelight flickered across his face, and in that fragile glow, the lines of enemy and savior blurred completely. Because what came next wasn't orders, it was warmth. The candlelight drew soft halos on the frostbitten walls. Shadows stretched, trembling like ghosts of soldiers who never made it home. The officer knelt by the stove, coaxing the weak fire with torn newspaper. His gloves were gone now. His fingers were raw, red from the cold. Each strike of the match lit up the women's faces, skeptical, exhausted, but alive. When the flame finally caught, the metal hissed, radiating a fragile circle of heat. The women drifted closer, silent. He didn't speak, didn't give orders. He just kept feeding the stove like a man keeping a promise no one asked for. Outside, the storm slammed against the corrugated roof. Snow piling against the door he'd locked hours earlier. From the inside. Geneva directives at the time demanded humane treatment for prisoners, but reports indicate only a fraction of Allied camps followed them as strictly as this one. Food shortages, overcrowding, and anger blurred the lines of discipline. Yet this officer name lost in records chose to follow not regulation, but decency. One of the women, a former nurse, offered her hands to help. He shook his head, then passed her the ladle anyway. They served soup together, thin, watery broth, but it smelled like life. He looked colder than us, she recalled, but he kept pouring soup. That small act carried more shock than cruelty ever could. The candle flickered against his face, catching something that wasn't authority. It was fatigue, compassion, maybe even guilt. War had stripped away everything except small human gestures, and here, in a wooden shack full of enemies, that humanity was burning quietly, stubbornly. Outside, the storm's howl softened into a dull roar. Inside, spoons scraped metal bowls. The women wrapped themselves in army blankets that still smelled faintly of oil and tobacco. For the first time since capture, no one feared the dark. Then, near the back of the barracks, one woman whispered what everyone else was thinking but couldn't say out loud, "He's protecting us." The others didn't answer, but you could see it in their eyes, the dawning confusion, the slow fracture of hatred they'd been taught to carry. And when dawn finally began to bleed grey through the windows, something else had already begun to spread rumour. By morning the barracks had changed, the fear was still there, but quieter, rearranged. The women moved differently now, glancing toward the door not with dread, but with something like trust. The story of what the American officer had done the locked door, the coffee, the blankets, was already spreading beyond their walls. In a war built on rumor, mercy traveled fastest. It started as whispers in the wash line and spread to nearby compounds. "There's an officer who protects the Frauenleger," they said. "He defies orders." The phrase sounded dangerous, too dangerous, but no one denied it. They'd seen the candles flickering through the night, the steam from soup rising like signals in the cold. By late February, over 1,500 female German POW were documented working voluntarily in Allied medical stations and field hospitals. Some were nurses. Others just wanted to feel useful again. At this camp, that shift began quietly with the women mending torn Allied uniforms, then sewing fresh bandages. No one told them to, they just did it. He didn't ask, one woman recalled later. He simply didn't stop us. In the corner of the barracks, 2 women wrote notes on scraps of ration paper, names of missing brothers, mothers, towns. The officer allowed it, even passed them to a Red Cross driver once a week. That simple gesture, mailing letters from prisoners, was technically against protocol. But regulations were already bending under the weight of exhaustion and frost. They called him mad. One guard muttered. "We called him decent," one prisoner would later write in a diary smuggled home years after. The women began greeting him differently. Not as Herr Officer, not as enemy, but with a nod, a look that said, "We see you." Humanity had entered the vocabulary of survival. But in wartime, kindness is never invisible for long. Headquarters didn't like stories that made war sound humane. When rumors reached the district command, claims that a U.S. officer was showing overfamiliarity with German prisoners, paperwork moved fast. Inspectors were dispatched not to praise but to probe, and the day they arrived the women knew instantly. The boots were cleaner, the faces colder, and the officer standing at the doorway, back straight, jaw tight, looked for the first time like a man waiting for judgment. They came just after noon, 2 jeeps grinding over frozen mud, tires hissing through slush. The sound carried before the sight, and every woman in the barracks went still. Through the frost-fogged window, they watched 3 officers step out. Polished boots, crisp collars, notebooks under arms. Inspectors, headquarters had arrived. The door swung open with practiced authority. The lead officer scanned the room, expression blank but eyes sharp. The women stood instinctively, forming ragged lines, their guard. Their officer saluted stiffly, his face a mask. The silence was surgical, unusual arrangements here. One inspector said, jotting notes, clean, quiet, cooperative. His tone made cooperative sound like a crime. Inspections like these were routine by 1945. Reports later revealed that 1 in 5 Allied POW camps faced inquiry for disciplinary irregularities. A bureaucratic phrase hiding everything from brutality to compassion. Here, the charge was the latter. The officer had blurred boundaries, shared coffee, read letters, locked himself in for safety, not control. The inspectors prowled between bunks, checking ration logs, glancing at the women's faces. One of them paused near the stove, frowning at the stack of mended Allied uniforms folded neatly beside it. "Who authorized this?" The officer didn't flinch. "I did," he said evenly. Idle hands freeze faster. The inspector looked up, pen hovering. "You're aware this is against conduct policy?" "Yes, sir." A long pause. The only sound was the wind scraping snow against the walls. The women barely breathed. The nurse from before watched his face, realizing he was lying not to save himself, but to protect them. Later testimonies from similar inspections note that sympathetic officers were often reassigned, sometimes reprimanded. In his file, what little survives, there's a line written in pencil, excessive leniency toward enemy personnel. He lied. One prisoner later said to protect us. The inspectors closed their notebooks. We'll file our report, the lead said curtly, stepping back into the cold. The jeep's engines rumbled to life, fading into the white distance. Inside, no one spoke for a long time. The officer stood by the door, hand still resting on the latch, eyes fixed on the snowstorm outside. Because he knew what came next. Orders always follow silence. The orders arrived 3 days later, typed, stamped, and cold. A folded slip inside an envelope marked personnel transfer. He read it once, twice, then folded it again like a letter he didn't want to open. The handwriting in the signature block wasn't familiar. It never was when the news was bad. That morning, the women noticed something different. The officer's duffel bag half. Packed near his bunk, his overcoat missing from its peg. Rumors spread fast, faster than the wind slipping through the cracks in the roof. He's being moved, someone whispered. They're taking him away. He didn't confirm it, not at first. He went about his rounds as usual, checking the stove, counting blankets, refilling the soup kettle, though the pot was nearly empty. Only when the truck arrived did he finally speak. Orders, he said simply, new post. The word new felt like a loss. The nurse, the same one who had smoked the first cigarette, stepped forward, eyes red from sleepless nights. Will you come back? She asked. He looked at her for a long second, the kind of look that tries to memorize a face before the world changes again. Then he gave the smallest shake of his head. By 1946, more than 130, zero American officers had been rotated home or reassigned from Europe. To headquarters, it was logistics. To these women, it was exile all over again. He lined them up one last time, out of habit, not regulation. Snow was falling, thick flakes landing on helmets and hair alike. The women stood straight, silent. When he saluted, it wasn't military, it was personal. A quiet gesture that said, I saw you as human, no words, no speeches. Just boots crunching on snow as he crossed the yard toward the waiting truck. Each step echoed like a closing chapter. The driver didn't look at him. Transfers were routine, but this one wasn't. From the barracks window, the women watched him go until the truck turned and vanished into the white horizon. No one cried, they just stood there, hands pressed to the frost glass, the warmth of their breath fading faster than he did. 3 days later, the snow melted enough for someone to find it, tucked under a tin cup near the stove. A letter, it was small enough to miss, creased, yellowing, folded twice, tucked under a dented tin cup by the cold stove. The women found it the morning after the snow eased. No envelope, no name, just a thin sheet of U.S. Army stationery with handwriting that leaned slightly to the right. The nurse unfolded it slowly, half afraid it might be a trick, another form of goodbye wrapped in duty. But the ink was real, the words simple. Rules are rules, but mercy is also one. That was it. No rank, no date, no signature. Just that line. The barracks stayed silent for a long time. Then one woman started crying, not the sharp sobs of grief, but quiet, steady tears of someone remembering warmth. The officer hadn't just left them supplies. He'd left them a sentence to hold on to. Archivists years later would find notes about similar gestures, dozens of anonymous letters left in Red Cross parcels, or taped to bunk posts between 1945 and 1946. Little fragments of humanity slipped through the machinery of war. He didn't owe us words. One survivor said decades later. But he gave us something that outlasted orders. The nurse folded the note and placed it back under the cup, like returning a relic to its altar. For weeks, they guarded it, straightened it when it curled, hid it when new guards came through. No one dared throw it away. Something shifted in them after that. Work became lighter, not easier. They shared their rations without being told. The hatred that had once filled every silence was slowly replaced by something else: recognition. The realization that even in war, someone had chosen not to hate them. For the first time, one wrote later, I wanted to believe the war could end inside us, not around us. Outside, the snow kept melting. Spring seeped into the mud. The world beyond the barbed wire was moving on, but inside that wooden barracks, one act of decency had rooted itself deep. Years later, when cameras and questions returned, that single line would resurface, ink faded, meaning stronger. And one of them would tell the story starting from the sound of a lock clicking. Shut. It was 1978 when the story finally found a voice. A camera crew from a West German documentary arrived at a modest apartment outside Hamburg. Inside, an old woman waited by the window, her hair white, her voice thin but steady. On the table in front of her sat a single photograph, faded, corners curling, its surface cracked like old ice. The interviewer asked her to describe the man in the picture. She looked at it for a long time before answering. "I don't remember his name," she said softly, "only that he locked the door behind us." The image was black and white, grainy, an American officer in a heavy winter coat, standing by a wooden barracks door. Behind him, faint outlines of women in shadow. She traced the edges with her finger, as if the gesture could bring him back. Less than 3% of female POW testimonies survived in archives. Most were lost, burned, or dismissed as irrelevant to the grand narratives of men and armies. But this one did. Her words, translated years later, carried the weight of memory untouched by politics. He locked us in, not to trap us, but to keep the world out. The interviewer asked what she meant. She smiled faintly. He understood something the uniforms forgot, that dignity can survive captivity. Outside, the city hummed with modern noise, cars, radios, neon. But inside that small room, time stayed frozen in 1945, in a snowbound barracks, in the flicker of candlelight on frightened faces. The story didn't need embellishment. The silence between her sentences said more than speeches ever could. Before the crew left, she unfolded a small plastic sleeve. Inside it was the note, the same one, creased yellow, ink nearly vanished. She placed it on the table for the camera, the words barely legible now, but still visible. Rules are rules, but mercy is also one. The cameraman zoomed in, and for a moment the frame filled with that single sentence. The past distilled into a truth no longer about sides or flags, but about choices. The woman looked up, eyes bright under the studio lights. "He was supposed to guard us," she said. "Instead, he reminded us we were still human." That's how she ended it, with gratitude, not victory. Because some wars end quietly, candle by candle.